You know, from time to time I clip something out of the newspaper that I think I'll talk about on TV, and then I never seem to get around to it, because I'd really much rather be talking about math. But these things come in here and they bother me, and mostly they're associated with various special interest groups whining about how the government isn't giving them enough money. And here's one article I clipped, and it's a long, detailed article about how this particular branch of the government services is being starved for funds, and the government doesn't care about this and that. And they're telling how bad it is, and they say, you know, over 5 years of the agency's history, caseloads have increased by 104%, yet budgets have increased by only 44% and 37%. And there's a lot of statistics like this, and they tell you how bad off they are. But you pour through the article just looking for, okay, what's the bottom line? How much money are these guys getting from the government? And they never say. I mean, you're wasting your time reading it, because the guy is hauling out statistics to show how badly off they are. But if they just give you the bottom line, I could decide for myself, you know, are they getting a reasonable amount of money? And of course, one of my favorite bunch of whiners is right where I work at the university. They're always complaining, and this week they had a rally at the legislature where they're saying they're not getting enough. And just to remind people, I mean, the bottom line, they do get $300 million a year total income. That's just the University of Manitoba. And it does amount to $15,000 per student per year for just the University of Manitoba. That's $15,000 per student per year. So, in all that talk you read in the newspapers about how they're short of money and how about this and that, they're not doing all that bad. I mean, what do they want? 18,000, 20,000. And you know, if they had 25 or 30, they'd still be complaining. So, you know, at a time when the country's going, you know, $30 billion deeper in the toilet every year, some groups in society have got to say, you know, we're really not doing all that bad in terms of the support we're getting from the government. But no one seems willing to do that. Anyway, like I say, I clip these things out of the newspaper sometimes, and I want to talk about them, and then I never get around to it. But what I realize is there's all these little problems we have here in this country, but there's in the world there are huge problems which seem to defy solution. So instead of worrying about these little things in Canada that are sort of non-problems, like bilingualism and everything, and the GST and free trade, I mean, how bad are we really off here? I should spend some of my effort that I spend arguing about these little things and try and solve a real problem, namely the problem in the Middle East. So what I've decided is on next week's show, which will air on Monday night, April 1st, that we would present the Math with Marty peace plan for the Middle East. And for better or worse, see how it goes over. It will hopefully be a plan that nobody will like, because the basic problem with the Middle East is the two sides are so far apart on what they claim to be willing to accept that there is very little prospect of what they call in the real estate business the meeting of minds, unless people start looking at hard choices of how much they're willing to give up to achieve some kind of settlement. Anyway, I think we'll leave that for next week. And in the meantime, we'll return to the topic that we started on last week, which, as I was discussing it, related to deformations in solids. We'll go over to the big board here. And before we resume our math, we'd like to point out that this is the 53,000th show being taped by in the VPW studios here on Stafford Street. And congratulations to all the people at VPW that have made this possible. 53,000 coming up on the odometer there. Now, the way this distortional topic began is I wanted to be able to do some calculations relating to deformations in solids And I was not satisfied with the basic physical description of solids which I had at my disposal, which went something like this, that if you take a piece of steel and pull on it so that it stretches 3%, that at the same time it will compress inwards by 1%. It'll get thinner while it gets longer. And I tried to, working with various combinations of pushing on it from this way and that way, I tried to formulate this description of steel in a more favorable way that had more mathematical symmetry to it. And I found one thing I could do that was rather obvious was that if I took a square piece of steel and pushed with equal forces from all 6 faces, and I'm only showing 4 faces here, but if I pushed with equal forces from all 6 sides, that each side would move an equal distance. And that was, part of a beginning of a description of the properties of steel that I wanted to be able to handle, but it wasn't complete because this description only covers changes in volume, but it doesn't cover distortional changes. And by taking the basic laboratory kind of experimental property of steel, which you measure by pulling on a bar of steel, I was able to work it into a kind of mathematical formulation that had an appearance that, to me, was a lot more favorable, and this is how I had it going. That if you stretch on it 8%, why go with 8? Let me say 2%. If I stretch it 2% in this direction, and at the same time, let me say what I want to do. Let me say it right. Let me say I want to pull with 200 pounds on this face and push into this face with 100 pounds from these sides. So I'm squeezing it in at the same time as I'm pulling it out. And here I'm pulling it out, and at the same time I'm squeezing it from 4 faces, 100 pounds front and back and 100 pounds side to side. That it would stretch 2% in these directions, and it would squish in 1% in these directions. And what was nice about this representation is that all the deformations were proportional to the forces. Whereas in the laboratory setup, you have deformations taking place in directions where you're not even pushing on it at all. With this particular combination of forces, which I'm labeling in this shorthanded way, 2 representing the axial tension this way, and -1 representing the fact that you're pushing in on these sides, and -1. With this system of forces acting, the displacements were proportional to the forces, and for some reason I thought that this was a beautiful way of representing things, and I'd like to convince you of that as well, that it is a good way of looking at things. And this is more or less where we've gotten up to, and what it's starting to look like is as though I want to represent any kind of deformation in steel by a combination of this type of system and the type of system I talked about earlier, which was purely compressional, uniform in all directions. And let me say right now that it turns out that the particular properties of steel, which is namely 3% versus 1%, and for some materials it's 4% to 1%. There's different ratios of lateral to axial transfer of force for different materials. But these factors turn out to be immaterial. No matter what your ratio is, and they call it the Poisson's ratio, but no matter what your Poisson's ratio is for your material, you always come around to a distribution of forces with this kind of weighting, 2, 1, and 1, to give you your mathematically happy kind of situation. And Let me clean the board up a little. And say, I've found this to be a nice description of kind of distortions in steel. Now, if I like this description for distortions in any solid, it's purely a geometric thing. It has nothing more to do with steel. Let's lay that to rest now. If I like this as a description, I should also like this one as a description. And I should also like this one as a description, because I'm merely taking permutations of the forces along which axis I choose to be the big tension and then which axis I'm going to be pushing on. These should all be equally nice descriptions. Now, the problem with saying, now it looks like I've got three different systems, and I can use these sort of the way you use vectors, that you would take any kind of distortion in any material and represent the net effect as the superposition or the combination of various amounts of these basic kinds of distortions. And that is not a correct way of looking at it, and you can very quickly see that it's not correct, because if you take vectors, like your along your z-axis, your x-axis, and your y-axis, and if you have three vectors and you add them all up, x plus y plus z vectors, then on a coordinate axis, they would add up to a total vector, which would be 1 unit in each direction. It would have its tail here, and it would have its point over here at location 1, 1, 1. So in vectors, the sum of these three vectors is a vector, which points out along this diagonal direction in 3D space. Whereas these kind of distortional quantities, if you take the three of these and add them up, you get 2 take away 1 is 0, 2 take away 1 is 0, 2 take away 1 is 0. They all add up to 0. So they are by no means vectors. And what are they? What are they? I think there's something called tensors. I think they're called tensors, and what we want to do is the same way three vectors is sufficient to describe any direction in space. We want to know how many tensors of this kind is sufficient to describe any basic form of distortion in space. And whereas after you thought of the first one, you might be tempted to add on two more like this and say we'll use them like vectors. That turns out to not be the way you do it. And here are the right tensors to use if that's the word for them.